My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am an immigration attorney with Scott Legal PC. I have handled a number of TN visas, which actually tend to be the most common visa option, one of the most common visa options that our firm handles, along with the E2 visa. And there's a really good reason for that. The TN visa is available for nationals of Canada or Mexico, and really is probably the most straightforward, simplest, and fastest option for a national of one of those two countries to come to the US and work for a US employer. Our firm's founder, Ian Scott, actually was on a TN visa before he changed to an E2 visa to start the firm. So we've personally navigated the process, and that really does inform the way that we work with our clients. A few housekeeping items before we get started with today's presentation. We are a full service immigration firm. So though we do focus on business immigration, including the TN, we handle the full spectrum of US immigration law, including family immigration, humanitarian immigration. So really any questions you might have regarding US immigration, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to help. This webinar is part of a series, so we try to do at least 2 of these a month, and usually we do quite a few more. I think right now we're hitting about 2 a week, and those cover, again, the full spectrum of US immigration, whether that's family or any other topic. We record our webinars, so today's presentation is being recorded. We post the full-length webinars on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in any other topic of US immigration law, do go to our YouTube channel where you can see the full-length webinars or a variety of shorter videos on those other topics. After this presentation, we will be sending you an email with a link to our YouTube channel, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. We'll also send you a comprehensive TN visa guide, which is a collection of really the best information that we have, that we've learned as a result of handling many TN visa applications. If you have a question during the presentation, do send it in through either the Q&A box or the chat function on Zoom, and I will be actively monitoring those. I plan to get through all of the questions during the presentation, and I'll either answer the questions as they come in if they're related to something I'm talking about in the moment, or I'll save them for the end. But either way, I do plan to get through all the questions, so don't hesitate to send those in. All right, let's go ahead and dive in and talk a little bit about the TN visa requirements. The first threshold requirement for a TN visa is that you need to have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. The TN visa was established through NAFTA, so it is an agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada. You don't need to be born in Canada or Mexico. You only need a passport from one of those 2 countries. You need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer, and that is a very broadly defined term. So that can be an LLC, it can be a corporation, it can be a small partnership, a sole proprietorship. So really, as long as there is a US employer that's given you a job offer, you would satisfy that US employer requirement. You need to be coming to the US to work for that employer in one of a number of listed professions. And now those professions are actually listed in the TN regulations, and I'm going to be referring to those regulations quite a few times through this presentation. So if you are at your computer, I'd recommend that you just go ahead and pull them up, because again, they really are, the regulations for the TN visa are both very clear actually, and very important, just because they have so much to do with the process of applying for a TN visa. So if you Google NAFTA TN regulations, then you will see a link to those regulations. And if you go ahead and click on those, it's good to have those up on the screen. Again, I'll be referring to those. If you scroll down, you'll see a list of professions, and it starts with accountant to architect, computer systems analyst. If you keep scrolling down, you see medical professions, you see scientists, scientific professions, as well as teaching positions. So you need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer in one of these listed professions. And that is a threshold requirement. If you're coming to work in a profession that's not in one of these listed professions, you will not be approved for the visa. Now, you need to have the required qualifications for the profession. And when I say that, I'm not talking about anything other than what the regulations say the qualifications are. So, for example, if you look at accountant, the qualifications for an accountant are baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or one of a number of professional licenses. So you see CPA, CA, CGA, etc. For an architect, you need a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a state or provincial license. Now, as you can tell, those qualifications are different between those two professions, accountants and architects. So you do need to check the qualifications for your specific profession that you're coming to the US to practice. A very common category is management consultants, and we'll talk more about management consultants later in the presentation. You can qualify based on a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or professional or equivalent professional experience that's established by basically 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So as you can tell from the management consulting category, you don't actually need a degree to qualify for that profession. That is one of the few professions that does not require a baccalaureate degree. So you need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer in one of the listed professions, excuse me, and you need to be qualified for that profession. Again, the qualification is listed in the regulations. Now, excuse me, you do need a job offer. So you need a pre-arranged job for a defined period of time. So in other words, what that means is the TN visa is not meant for someone to come to the US and do a job hunt. You actually need to have the job offer in hand and a letter from the employer talking about that job offer at the time that you're applying for the TN visa. And we'll talk about that more later in the presentation. And finally, in that job that you're coming to the US to perform, you actually need to be performing those job duties. So in other words, what that means is I'm sorry, let me get a sip of water real quick. So what that means is you, for example, if you have a job in the US where you'll be acting as a marketer, let's say that you are very talented with social media and the company wants to hire you for its social media campaign. But your undergraduate degree is in economics, you qualify as an economist based on the TN regulations. You cannot come to the US in the economist category, even if you qualify for it, to work in marketing, social media marketing. You need to be coming to the US to actually be working as an economist in that role. So how does the government define what a role is actually supposed to do? The government publishes that through something called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH. This is another link that if you're at your computer, I recommend you pull up. Go ahead and go to Google and put into Google OOH, and you can put anything, OOH accountant, OOH economist. Once you pull up that page, you'll see a tab at the top of the screen that says what they do. When you click that link, you'll actually see the list of job duties that the government thinks that role does. So you need to be coming to the US, not necessarily to be performing exactly those job duties, but you do need to be performing job duties that are aligned with those job duties. A majority of your time needs to be spent on those. Generally speaking, it's okay if a minority of your time is not on job duties that are aligned with those, but certainly a majority of your time needs to be spent on those job duties or job duties aligned with what are in the OOH for your profession. So, what is sponsorship? This is the title of today's presentation. Does the TN visa require sponsorship? And generally speaking, the answer to that question is no. The TN visa does not require sponsorship, but let's talk about what I mean when I say that. First, it's important to get a sense of definitions. So, what do I mean when I say sponsorship? And generally speaking, what do employers mean when they talk about sponsorship? Sponsorship in the immigration context generally means that an employer needs to test the US labor market, needs to figure out what the prevailing wage is for a role. And that wage is almost always higher than minimum wage, if not always higher than minimum wage. They need to provide certain protections to the employee. So, for example, they need to make sure that the employee actually has active work. They can't be what's called benched, which means someone coming to the US and then being basically not given active work. They sometimes an employee, if they're terminated, they need to be paid for their return transportation to their home country. Sometimes the employer, through sponsorship, needs to actually see if there are other qualified U.S. workers for the role before they hire the TN worker. None of those requirements applies to a TN applicant. And for that reason, we would say that the employer does not need to sponsor the TN employee. So TN visas, someone who's in the US on a TN visa is essentially an at-will employee. So they are really no different from any other at-will employee in the US. And what that means is they can be fired, they can quit, they need to be paid the minimum wage based on the federal law and the state law, but that's the same for anyone who's working at an employer in the US. So any employee would be protected by that. There's no additional sponsorship requirement there. The TN visa doesn't require that the employer test the labor market either. They don't need to advertise the job. They don't need to see if there's a qualified US worker for the job. If there is a national of Canada or Mexico who goes to the employer and says, "Hey, do you have a job for me?" and the employer says yes, then that's that. The employer can then provide to the employee an employer letter that basically lays out what the job duties will be, how long they intend to employ the worker, what they intend to pay the worker. And then the worker would basically apply at a consulate or a port of entry and get the visa. So again, much lower requirements for the TN than even say an H-1B or an L, and certainly than a green card, which if you have an employment-based green card, does have significant, generally speaking, significant requirements to actually test the labor market and sponsor that worker for a green card. None of those requirements would apply for a TN. I'm going to talk more later in the presentation about filing for a TN at a port of entry or at a consulate, and also the option of filing from within the United States. For now, just keep in mind that Canadians have the option to apply for a TN visa at a consulate or at a port of entry, so an airport or a land crossing. It is extremely convenient for Canadians to apply for a TN visa since they can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. They cannot apply at a port of entry. And both Canadians and Mexicans, if they're inside the US, they have the option of applying through USCIS. So that would either be an extension of status if they're already in TN status, or if they're not in TN status, let's say they are on an F1 student visa or even a visitor visa, they would apply for a change of status to TN if they're already inside the US. Now, regarding sponsorship, why are these two items under the sponsorship page? The reason is that if an applicant is applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, the worker, the prospective employee, is the one who's filing the application. If the worker is applying within the US to USCIS, then the employer does need to sign the form I-129, which is the application form that goes to USCIS. Does that create any additional obligations on the employer? No, not really. It is just the way that the application works in the US is that the employer submits it. But that employee would still be at will. There's no additional requirements as I mentioned before, regardless of whether the applicant applies at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS. So let's talk about some differences between Canadians and Mexican nationals. I already touched on these, but let's get a little more in depth. So, as I mentioned before, Canadians really do have it very, very easy and convenient when it comes to a TN. They really can show up at a land crossing or at an airport and bring their application materials. We'll talk about those a bit later in the presentation, and present those to the border officer and immediately have a decision on their TN application. So if they are approved, then they would be admitted into the US for a 3-year period, during which they'd be able to work for the TN employer. The work authorization is limited to the TN employer, so you don't have unrestricted work authorization on a TN, you're limited to the TN employer. Now, if the spouse of the Canadian national who's applying for the TN is also a Canadian national, then they can also apply at a port of entry, and they would get what's called TD visa. TD is the status that's given to dependents of someone on a TN visa, whether they are a spouse or a child. TD status gives the person the ability to enroll in school. However, they cannot work. So TD status does not give the dependent the ability to work. In order to work, they'd need to seek an alternative status. So they might be able to apply for their own TN visa if they're a national of Canada or Mexico, or they might be a better fit for another option, whether it's an E2, H1B, whatever it is, L visa. But if they're in TD status, they cannot work. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a U.S. consulate if they're outside the U.S. So that would, excuse me, that would require them filing the DS-160 online. That is the online form that goes to the consulate. Then they would be called in to the consulate for their interview. They would bring their supporting materials and be interviewed. And at that point, they would receive their TN visa. Now, in the past, nationals of Mexico were limited to 2 years on their TN visa. Fortunately, recently, the option of a 4-year visa became available if you're willing and able to pay an additional application fee. Almost always, if you're able to pay that fee, we would recommend you do it. It's just much more convenient to not have to go to the consulate for that. So now, let's distinguish the visa validity period from status, regardless of how long your visa is issued for. Whether you're, let's say you're a Mexican national who gets a 2-year visa. When you enter the US, each entry, you tend to be given 2 years of status. Even if you have a 4-year visa, the amount of status you'll be given when you enter the US is typically 3 years, 3 years of status. So that is regardless of the length of time of the visa. What a visa is really a window of time when you can ask for permission to enter the US. That's what the visa is. But each time you enter the US on a visa, you're given what's called status. And that means you need to leave the US within a certain period of time. The visa has no bearing on when you need to leave the US. Okay, what has bearing is your I-94, which is what defines your length of status. And just to repeat, because I know I said 2 years, the period of status is typically 3 years when you enter the US on a TN. You can renew the TN visa or status indefinitely as long as you remain eligible. You might get questions once you've been on a TN, 2 or 3 times, renewed it. You might start getting questions about your ties to your home country, but as long as you can show that you maintain ties to your home country and you do have the intention to not pursue a green card in the US, you are legally allowed to renew your TN visa indefinitely. And nationals of Mexico are able, in certain circumstances, to renew their visas through the mail, but you'll find out if you're eligible to do that once you submit the application to the consulate. They'll typically reach out to you and let you know that you qualify for that more streamlined renewal by mail. So let's quickly talk about a couple categories that are uniquely challenging. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about how you need to be coming to the US to work in one of a number of listed professions. Two of those professions are uniquely challenging: management consultant and economist. And the reason for those is different for each. So, a management consultant, the reason that this category is challenging is that it is one of the few categories, as I mentioned before, that does not require a college degree or really any degree. You can apply for a TN visa in the management consulting category based solely on experience, whether that's 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the engagement. So for that reason, the management consulting category can be a catch-all category for people who don't qualify for other professions. So the government's aware of that, and they do scrutinize those applications. But to take a step back, not all management consultant applications are risky. If you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, Bain, BCG, McKinsey, I know those are the top tier firms. There are many, many management consulting firms. If you're coming to the US to work for one of those firms, this category is not necessarily risky. Where this category is risky is if you're coming to the US to work for an employer that is not a management consulting firm. So an example might be helpful here. Let's say that you are an expert in solar panels, the manufacture of solar panels, or selling solar panels. And there is a company in the US that is in the business of manufacturing and selling solar panels. And they want you to come to the US to basically help them improve their efficiencies, increase their profits, etc. So you in that case would not be coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. You'd be coming to the US to work for that solar panel company, advising them on how to improve their efficiencies. That would be a risky application. Again, just because you're coming to the US to not work for a management consulting firm. Now, how would you structure that application so that you're improving your odds of being approved? What's really important to do in those cases is to make it very clear that you are coming to the US to address a very specific challenge that the employer is facing, and that you are uniquely qualified to address that challenge. So continuing with our example, the application, the company would make it very clear what their challenge is. So maybe they have a supply chain issue, maybe they have a manufacturing issue, or an issue marketing their solar panels. A very specific issue that you would be coming to the US to address. To address that issue, the time frame would be limited. So not only is the scope of your work limited, you're addressing that specific challenge, but also the time frame. You don't necessarily need to come to the US for 3 years. Maybe it's going to take 1 year for you to address this challenge. So it's important in the application to show you really are coming to address a specific challenge. You're not coming to the US to fill a permanent role at the company. The regulations refer to this as a supernumerary role. So the role does need to be supernumerary, which means it is not a permanent role at the company. It is, again, really a consultant coming in to advise the company. And as I've suggested, there are ways that you can indicate in the application, other than explicitly saying that that's what you're doing, there are ways to indicate that. So, for example, it can be very helpful to have a consulting agreement. So this is an agreement that defines the scope of your work, that exactly what your deliverables will be, the time frame for those deliverables. And again, hopefully that time frame is less than 3 years, if you're able to accomplish the goals within that time frame. Sometimes it's helpful for your compensation to be tied to those deliverables rather than a salary. A salary tends to suggest more of a permanent role versus, say, an independent contractor agreement where you're paid based on your deliverables. Again, these are just ways to indicate in the application that this is not a permanent role. This really is a temporary role where you're coming in to consult for the business. And I mentioned before, you do want to show that you are uniquely qualified for the role. So you do need to, if unless, you can qualify for the TN based on a baccalaureate degree in business or management. But the other way is through experience. So, if you are qualifying based on experience, and even if you're qualifying based on a degree, make it clear how you are the ideal person to come in to the US and really address the challenge that is being experienced by the US employer. The reason that the economist category is challenging is completely different. There was a memo issued by the US government in November of 2017 that explicitly narrowed the scope of who can qualify for this category. So specifically, what the regulations basically say, or I should say the policy says, is that those coming into the US in the economist category need to actually be performing the job duties of an economist. And again, look at the OOH Occupational Outlook Handbook to see what the government thinks an economist does. They need to specialize in either microeconomics or macroeconomics. They need to study the impact of, say, supply and demand on the behavior of individuals or firms, study economic indicators for sectors of the economy, things like this that are really kind of, well within the scope of what an economist is expected to do traditionally. Now, what is not included in that definition? So when I said the government narrowed the scope, they explicitly excluded financial analysts and market research analysts. So basically, if you are trying to come to the US to work as an economist, but your job duties involve those of financial analysts, and what that means is finding opportunities basically to invest money for profit. Market research analysts or marketing specialists are really looking at at developing advertising materials, figuring out how to sell products and services. If you're coming to the US to do those job duties, you're going to have a problem applying under the economist category. So, frankly, what you would do in those circumstances is to really think about whether the employer is able and willing to actually have you work more as an economist. Or you might be able to apply as a management consultant. Let's say that the business is experiencing issues, with their marketing. You might be able to apply as a management consultant to address that specific challenge. That's another avenue. The other option is to just apply for a different visa. So the H-1B, the L-1, the O-1, these might be better options for you if your job duties really are not aligned with economists and are more financial analysts or market research analysts job duties. So let's talk a little bit about the process. We talked about how the process for Canadians and Mexicans is different. But what does it actually look like to apply for a TN visa? So if you are Canadian, you will gather your application materials together. The application is going to consist of, first of all, proof that you are a national of Canada. Of course, this would go for Mexican nationals as well. That would be your passport. You would also have proof that you qualify for the profession. So again, you would go to the regulations. And let's say you're applying as an accountant based on your baccalaureate degree in accounting. You need to actually have your original diploma with you. So the government, border officers and consular officers see a lot of fraud. So you actually do need to have original documents or certified copies of those documents. So you would prove that you qualify. So if you're qualifying based on a degree, you'd bring a copy, or I'm sorry, the original of that diploma. If you need to bring your transcript, so why would you need a transcript? Generally speaking, you need your baccalaureate degree, if you're qualifying based on your degree, needs to be in the field that you're applying in. So if you're applying as an accountant, it needs to be in accounting. If you're applying as an economist, your degree needs to be in economics. It is possible to apply with a related degree. So as an economist, if your degree is in finance, that might work, or in math, that might work. But as you get farther from economics, for example, if you're applying as an economist, you're going to want to bring your transcript, certified copy of your transcript, and go through and really highlight how your coursework really is consistent with the coursework that would have been part of an academic program in economics, or actually in the field that you're coming to the US to work in. Again, bring original documentation, because you don't want to have issues at the border because of that. So, proof of your nationality, proof that you qualify for the role. If it's a diploma, if it's based on your degree, bring a diploma. If it's based on experience, you need original signed experience letters. So management consultants need letters proving 5 years of experience. Those would be letters from past employers. And those letters do need to have the original signatures on them. Let's see, the other really critical piece of a TN application is an employer letter. So what is that? That is a letter that is written by the employer, has the original signature of a representative at the company, whether that's a high-level executive or an HR, human resources representative. And that letter is going to talk about who the employer is. It's going to talk about why they need someone in this profession. It's going to talk about what they intend to pay the person, how long they intend to employ the person. Typically, that's 3 years or less, because that's the limit of the period of status that you'll be granted in the US. And it will talk about the applicant. It'll talk about how the employee qualifies for the profession based on the TN regulations. It'll also talk about why that worker is the ideal fit for the role. So that can go beyond the TN qualification requirements. So, they might qualify for the TN because they have a bachelor's degree in economics, but they might qualify for the role at the company because they have a lot of experience doing things, that are related to what the job requires. You don't want to confuse the two, though. You don't want to suggest to the government that you're applying as an economist because you have all of this experience, because again, you can't qualify for the economist role based on experience alone. You qualify based on the degree. So make it clear, you qualify for the TN based on the degree, but you're a great person for the role based on your experience. That's fine to get into. Just keep the two separate, so that the officer's not confused. And so officers do get confused over these things, and oftentimes when they are confused, they will simply deny just because it's within their discretion to do so. So it's helpful to keep an application clean, to keep it clear and straightforward. Now, the employer letter, again, is going to talk about who you are as the employee applicant, why you're qualified, and really how you're the ideal fit. And that letter is what the border officer or the consular officer is going to look to, probably more than anything else, to make sure that you are eligible for the TN visa. So again, that employer letter really is a key piece of the application. So basically everything I've just described applies to Canadians, but it also applies to nationals of Mexico. If you're applying at a consulate, you would submit your form DS-160, which is an online form. When you're called in to the interview at the consulate, you would bring everything I just talked about: the employer letter, proof of your qualifications, obviously your passport, and you would typically leave your passport at the consulate, and they would either mail it to you or call you in when it's ready for pickup with your visa in it, and then you'd be able to enter the US with that. The third and final option, which you see on your screen, is applying from within the US. So if you're already in the US, maybe you're an F1 student, maybe you're a B2 visitor, whatever it is, you do have the option of applying through USCIS. And to do that, the US employer would file the form I-129 with USCIS, along with the application fee. Currently it's $460. And they would include in that application the supporting documentation. You don't need to mail originals to USCIS, so you can mail copies to USCIS, but you would mail a copy of your passport, a copy of your diploma if you're qualifying based on your degree, or copies of your experience letters, a copy of the employer letter, everything that you would be giving at the port of entry or to the consulate, you would send into USCIS. Now, we prepare applications that go to USCIS, that go to the port of entry, or that go to the consulate. And when I say that the employer would submit the application, what it looks like in practice when someone comes to us, if they say, I'm applying at a port of entry, oftentimes we will have no interaction with the employer unless that's the client's preference. So sometimes the client will say, can you talk with my employer? Can you help to focus the job duties so that they really are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And so we'll work with the employer to really make sure that the job duties they'll actually be doing in the US are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. But otherwise, if the client is applying at a port of entry, there's usually not a need for us to interact with the employer. The employer will have given the employee an offer letter. We can draft that employer letter, and then it goes to the employer. They will sign, give it back, and then it's the employee who will handle the application process. If the applicant is applying through USCIS, we would typically prepare the USCIS forms, provide those to the employer. They would sign them, send them back to us, and then we're able to submit those to USCIS along with the application fee. But really, again, sticking with the theme of the presentation today, which is, does a TN require sponsorship? The obligations on the employer are really minimal. When I say that the employer will submit the form to USCIS, it really is a matter of them looking at the forms, making sure they're accurate, and then just signing the forms. And then we would typically submit those. Or if they want to, they can as well. Let's quickly cover some tips and common TN visa pitfalls before we get to the questions. I know a number of questions have come in, which is great. So it is always helpful to call the port of entry beforehand. So this became especially important during COVID because ports of entry started changing their hours. They started having unique requirements. Use certain entrances, use certain waiting rooms, don't go to certain areas of the port of entry. So as a result of that, we do always recommend that you call the port of entry ahead of time. Just make sure you're aware of what hours, what times they're accepting TN applications. And if there's anything unique you need to know about that port of entry, it's really just an easy thing to do to give you peace of mind and make sure that you're not wasting a trip. Make sure that the employer is available at the time that you plan to either go to the consulate or to the port of entry. So as I mentioned, the employer letter does need to be signed by the employer. So it needs to be an original signature. Sometimes the consular officer or the border officer will pick up the phone and will call the employer just to make sure the job offer is legitimate. So just give your employer a heads up that they might get a call. Probably not, but they might get a call just so that they're available. Again, just to make sure that you don't have any issues in case the officer does call. The questions are usually not going to be in depth. It's usually more to verify that the offer is legitimate and consistent with what's represented in the letter. So, not necessary for the employer to necessarily study a long time for this call. Just make sure they have their phone on them and they're aware that you're going to be applying at a certain time. Bring original documentation, your diploma or official transcripts if necessary, original signed versions of the employer letter and original experience letters if you're applying based on experience. It is one thing I failed to say before. The employer letter should be on company letterhead. So consular officers or border officers want to see the official company's letterhead for the employer letter with the contact information of the employer. So do make sure that that is included as well. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. What that means is it's not a green card. It is not intended to be used as a pathway to permanent residency in the United States. So do make sure that that you don't suggest to the officer that you're going to apply for a green card, and that's not your intention, right? Your intention on a TN needs to be you're coming into the US to temporarily, and when I say temporarily, I mean 3 years, temporarily come to the US to work for a US employer. Now, if after you enter the US, your employer says, hey, we really like you, we want to sponsor you for a green card, great. It's okay to pursue a green card at that stage. Or if you fall in love with someone in the US who's a green card holder or a US citizen, that is okay too. People change their mind. That is not misrepresentation. That's not a problem. What is a problem is when you are trying to enter on a TN and you know that when you enter, you're going to be pursuing one of these green card options on that visit. That's when you can get into trouble. Now, a common question we get is the government going to want to see, that I have these ties to my home country? Usually that's not an issue until, like I said before, you've had a TN visa a few times. You've been on a TN visa for like 7, 8, 9 years. At that point, they might start asking you, do you actually plan to return to your home country and prove to us that you have ties to your home country? So it's always a good idea to have documentation that you have a bank account in your home country, that you have family there, that you have, if you have a mortgage, if you own an apartment, whatever it is, that you maintain ties in your home country. It's always a good idea to have that. But usually, based on what we see, officers are not going to ask about that unless you're 6, 7, 8, 9 years into a TN, into renewing a TN. All right. So a number of questions have come in. Thank you guys for sending those. Let's just go down the list. I am a management consultant and I want to apply for the TN visa under this category. Canadian citizen. They ask for 5 years of experience. Does the experience have to be in Canada? No, the experience does not have to be in Canada. That's an excellent question. You can have that experience really anywhere. It is important that the experience is legitimate, obviously. If the experience is in a country where the government might be concerned about fraud, there's a chance that they'll scrutinize it. But ways to address that, again, make sure that experience letter that employer is giving you has the original signature on it. Make sure it has their contact information. There's a chance that the officer will reach out to them. It's not likely, but it could happen. So just make sure that you are really doing everything you can to show the officer that the experience is legitimate. But no, the experience does not have to be in Canada or Mexico for that matter, or the US. What are processing times for Mexican nationals applying on a TN? Is an expedite request possible, and what are the logistics of the expedite request? So processing times at the consulate do change. So it is very hard to give a sense of what you are very likely to see now. In general, though, I would say 1 to 3 months is a good ballpark estimate of what you're likely to see at a consulate in Mexico for a TN. Again, that could change. If there's a spike of COVID and they reduce staffing, that period is obviously going to go up. If they increase their efficiency, it'll go down. But 1 to 3 months is oftentimes what we see. An expedite request, generally speaking, is not possible, though I would say visit the consular website. There are times that you can reach out, and if you can point to a very concrete impact that the delay is going to have on the US employer, the consulate might be willing to give you an expedited interview. However, I would say the general rule is that no, an expedite request is not available. Oftentimes consulates, not just Mexico, but across the board, will only consider expedite requests if they really are a life or death circumstance. Not all consulates are like that. There are consulates that will accept expedite requests, but in general, it's not likely you're going to get one for a TN. I'm an IT business analyst. I've heard some ambiguity with the role, provide inputs. You would look at the TN profession that's most closely aligned with your job duties, and see if you qualify. If there's ambiguity with the role, it's probably going to come down to how the employer letter frames the job duties versus what's in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So I would always say, look at the job duties you're likely to be performing in the US, see what jobs or professions are listed in the TN regulations, go into the Occupational Outlook Handbook and see what's most closely aligned to what you'd be doing in the US, and then just make sure that your job duties are aligned with those. And if you need to work with the employer to say, hey, I'm going to need to spend more time doing A, B, and C so that it's more closely aligned, you might have to do that. But business analysts, IT business analysts, frankly, I'm not aware of what the closest TN category would be, and that's what I would need to know to talk about it being risky. If it's not falling under management consultant, then I think you would really focus on what I said before, the job duties and making sure you qualify. Can someone in a TN visa as an independent contractor qualify in a full-time position? The answer is yes. You can be an independent contractor and qualify for a TN visa. You don't have to be a W-2 employee. In fact, if you're applying as a management consultant, it can sometimes be advantageous to be an independent contractor, again, to show that the role is not permanent and is really limited to certain deliverables. The other thing that I didn't mention before that this question reminds me of is that you can have a part-time role on a TN. So part-time work is fine on a TN. Also, you can work for more than one employer. You do need to get approval to work for each employer. So in other words, if you're in the US working for one TN employer, let's say you're working 20 hours a week for that TN employer, and another employer says, hey, we want you to work for us on a TN as well, you can do concurrent TN status. And basically, you would apply to USCIS, or if you want to leave and come back in, you would apply at a port of entry or at the consulate in Mexico. And make it clear to them that you're applying for 2 TN employers, so you need concurrent approval. And once you get the approval, you could work for both employers. It's very important to remember you need to wait for that approval before starting work for the second employer. Do the O1, H1B, or L1 require sponsorship? I would say yes. Those visas have far higher requirements on the employer. The requirements are different for each of those. So we do have presentations on those visas as well as a number of YouTube videos. So sign up for a future webinar or check out our YouTube channel on those webinars if you want to know more about the O1, H1B, or L1 visa. Okay, so this next question is really talking about their specific circumstances. I'm not going to get into specific qualifications. So go ahead and schedule a consultation if you want to talk about how you qualify for a role and what might be a good fit, and we'd be happy to talk with you about that. I'm going to keep the questions and answers to more general ones for the webinar. I'm a Canadian citizen. Okay. What would be the correct way to proceed if my passport will expire in 2025? I have my visa valid until 2027. So great question. So basically what you have 2 options. If your passport is going to expire and you have a visa that goes for longer than that date, you can either apply to renew your passport and ask to get the current passport back without being damaged. So oftentimes when you renew a passport, they'll punch a hole in the old one. It's very important that the visa not have a hole in it because that would invalidate the visa. So, excuse me, if you're able to get the old passport back and the visa is not damaged, then you can bring that old passport with the undamaged visa and your new passport, and it's fine to travel with those 2, but you would need both. Or you could get the new passport, renew your passport, and apply for a new visa. So you have those 2 options. Does the job need to be full-time? No, it does not. Minimum hours per week? Not sure there really is a minimum. I mean, I would probably recommend at least 15 or 20 hours just because Any less, you may get questions from the border officer, but legally speaking, I don't believe that there is a minimum number of hours that's stated in the law. And part-time work is certainly an option. Are there renewal limits, and how does the process work for a TN visa employee to change or move? There are not renewal limits. As long as you qualify for the role, meaning, professionally, you have the professional qualifications and the role in the US, the job duties remain consistent with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you can renew the TN visa indefinitely. There is not a limit in the law. You raise a great question. I mentioned before concurrent employment. Excuse me. So concurrent employment is an option when you want to work for more than one employer, but you can also change employers. So let's say you want to leave your current TN employer and work for a new one. You can do that. The important thing again is you cannot start working on a TN before you have approval. If you do, you would be committing unauthorized work that would compromise your current status. It would cause problems in the future if you want to extend or change your status or apply for a visa. So don't work without authorization. So to avoid that, let's say you're in the US working with a TN employer, you get an offer from another employer, and they want you to leave your current employer. They could submit an application to USCIS for an extension of TN status with them being the sole employer. Once that's approved, then you could start working for the new employer and leave your old employer. Or you could, if you're Canadian and you wanted to kind of control the time frame a little more, you could take the new TN application with the new employer, leave the US, re-enter on the new application, and let them know that you're going to be working just for that employer. And as soon as you enter, your TN status would be eligible for the new employer, and would not be eligible for the old employer unless you apply for concurrent employment. Now, one thing I realized is relevant to this that I didn't mention before is if you're applying through USCIS, you have two options in terms of the timing. The USCIS does offer premium processing, which will give you a decision in 2 weeks. So if you do have a new employer who says to you, I want you to come work for me, leave your employer, they could file an application with USCIS premium processing and get you a decision within 2 weeks. So that is a great thing if you're in a hurry. If you don't choose premium processing, I think right now the I-129 is taking, we can actually quickly check. If you search USCIS processing times and you choose form I-129 and TN, then you will see that the estimated processing time is 2 months. So that may or may not be accurate, but so you have the option of 2 weeks or an estimated 2 months. Okay, let's see. If I want to apply for the management consultant firm to work as a management consultant, does similar experience such as investment banking make a fit? Probably not. You want to make sure that your experience is related to what you're going to be doing. So if you're applying to work as a management consultant, your experience needs to be working as a management consultant. You can always try. Now that's the thing is what if I get denied? If you get denied at a port of entry or at the consulate, you can apply again. And usually it's not a problem. If you get a sense that they're likely to deny, it's usually a good idea to ask to withdraw the application, so that it's not marked on your record as a denial. And usually no problem at all to apply again. You'd want to make material changes to the application. So find out why they denied it. Maybe it's because you applied based on experience that was not related. So if that's the case, you could try to get that experience or look for another category of the TN that might be a better fit. But in general, no, I would not recommend applying based on experience as in investment banking. Do I have better chances if I'm a management consultant with a specific firm in my home country and I will be working with the same company in the US? Better chances. Maybe, maybe not. It really depends on a number of factors in the application. If you clearly are qualified as a management consultant and the firm is clearly a management consulting firm, I wouldn't think of it as a risky application, whether you're going to the same company or a different company. Either way, I think it's a fairly low risk application. Do you need a TN visa for remote work for a US company but plan to stay in Canada? If you're not coming into the US, you don't need a visa at all. So the visa is only required if you physically want to come into the US. Are some consulates better than others? Yes. So in Mexico, you have Mexico City, Guadalajara. Um, yeah, it depends with time. So, there are changes in terms of where consular officers are. Not all the consulates are created equal, but yeah, we do work with our clients to figure out where the ideal place to apply is. That's one of the services we offer. Um, so what about the timing for a TN visa application in Canada? If you're a Canadian, you're probably not going to apply at a consulate. So the timing would be whenever you can get to the port of entry, whether that's an airport or a land crossing, and you'd have a decision immediately. If you have a dependent who is not a national of Canada, so let's say you're married to a national of Germany, then they would have to apply at a consulate. So they could not apply with you at a port of entry. And right now, Canada consulates, they're moving faster than they were under COVID, certainly. So Toronto, I would probably give you the same estimate as I said for Mexican consulates. Between 1 and 3 months is typically what we're seeing for those, from the date of submission to the date of the consulate after actually calling the person in. I am a procurement manager in Canada. Is it possible to apply under management consultant? Could be. It's all about framing what the challenges you're addressing them with. So if you're coming to work for a company that needs someone to help them address a challenge regarding procurement, you might be able to qualify. It is a risky application. By its very nature, the management consulting category is risky. It doesn't really matter what you're doing as long as you're not working for a management consulting firm. If you're working for a management consulting firm, it's less risky. But there's no reason that I would say no, you can't apply as a procurement manager. It would just be a matter of showing that the role really does fit within what I said before a management consultant is going to be doing, according to what the government thinks they do. And again, look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook, look at what they define as what a management consultant does, and frame the application to show that you really are coming in to address a finite, very, limited in time and scope problem. And that's really what it comes down to. We have, I always have to say the disclaimer, our past results don't predict future outcomes, but we do have a very good success rate, even for management consultant applications. It's just a matter of planning them very carefully, and honestly and transparently, but being very thoughtful about how you do that. Is it possible to request a green card if I'm in the US with a TN visa? The answer is yes. Being on a TN visa does not preclude you from applying for a green card. You just need to independently qualify for the green card. So the way it works in the US is a TN doesn't lead to a green card. But if your employer wants to sponsor you for a green card, or if you end up falling in love with someone and marrying a green card holder or a US citizen, then certainly you can apply for a green card while you're on a TN visa in the US. I think the challenge is that once you apply for a green card, you're going to have a very hard time renewing the TN. So they're going to know that you have a pending green card application. They're going to question your long-term intent of whether you actually want to stay in the US or leave. And again, the TN is a non-immigrant visa, meaning you need to intend to leave eventually. So you need to think about the timing. Maybe renew the visa before the green card application is filed. But the answer is yes, it is possible to do that. You just need to plan very carefully. Do schedule a consultation. That is an area where there are some pitfalls, and it can be very helpful to talk with an attorney. If the job requires a bachelor's, can you still get the TN if you have 3 years post-secondary but plus 3 years relevant experience? All that's going to be defined in the regulations. So for some jobs, they'll say post-secondary degree plus experience. If the category does not say that, the answer is no. You cannot qualify with that. There are no substitutes for qualification. So look at the regulations, make sure that you have the qualifications. Those were excellent questions. Thank you all for taking the time. We are a minute past time. I hope this presentation was helpful. Reach out to us if we can be helpful at all to schedule a consultation on our website. You can find the link to do that. In the meantime, keep an eye out for our email. We hope to see you on future webinars. Check out our YouTube channel and our blog. Reach out if we can be helpful at all. Thank you so much for your time.